which is, getting London growing again, is quite a change from the assumptions that would have underpinned an event of this kind at pretty well any time up till arguably the beginning of last year, though even there was some sort of question hanging over the city's future, I think, after the Brexit event in 2016. I'm going to say a little bit about both of these, but it's a big change for a city which had suffered 20 or 30 years of relative and occasionally absolute economic decline from 1945 actually to the 80s, really, so nearly 40 years. And then this remarkable growth in population and the economy, to the point that, in very British way, the city's success became a national embarrassment in many ways. And I'm sure we'll hear a bit about that, very British. And there's now, as I implied, the sort of twin or even triple assault of COVID and Brexit, and indeed the third leg on this unhelpful stool, levelling up. And I'll say a bit about all of those briefly. So if we just take COVID first, for all sorts of reasons that I'm sure we're going to touch on, London's gone from having what had been a sustained fall in unemployment with a large rise in employment to the highest rate of unemployment in the UK by some distance, which leaves us, before we get on to the levelling up discussion, in the fascinating position of the government having a stated policy to level up away from the region of the country with the highest level of unemployment. And I think buried in that must be that London can always recover. It's hard to see any other logic, but anyway, I'm sure we'll discuss that. Some of that unemployment is particularly concentrated in outer London boroughs. So even though central London has seen a radical decline, as many city centres in Britain and overseas have in their economic activity, unemployment has risen fastest in outer London, most amongst the young, and particularly amongst young males who from ethnic minorities. So there's this whole range of issues buried in that. And we're in a position where some industries, which London as a gateway to Britain, travel, arts and culture, if they don't recover, then the whole UK's industries in those sectors won't recover, ditto the National Railway. So a lot of really important stuff buried in the impact of COVID-19. And then there's Brexit. Madeline's here to talk about this, amongst other things, where London, which had been one of the most open cities in the world for migration, a lot of it from the EU, but not only from the EU. I mean, a lot of it was coming from the rest of the world, which the government was never able to control either, by the way. That steady flow of particularly lower paid migrants will be, well, if not halted from, it will be halted from the EU, but there'll be very different rules, and we're going to hear about that. And the question of whether London's economy can grow in the future quite as fast as it did, or whether it might start sucking in people from the rest of the United Kingdom instead, I'm not sure that's what levelling up was all about, are definitely things to see on the agenda here. I mean, fascinating to me, just as, you know, many of the people at this event will be, as an observer of the London scene, politically and economically, how the Conservative government took virtually no interest in London's largest industries, financial and business services, creative industries, in doing in the Brexit deal. Remarkable turn of events, which tells us something about the shifting tectonic plates of British politics, whose electoral consequences we saw something of last week. And then lastly, levelling up. Now, what's intriguing, and it was still present in the Queen's speech yesterday, is levelling up is purely in Britain described as people in some parts of the country being poor or in need of levelling up help, and in others being fine. So there's no sense that there's a mixture of rich and poor in any region. Indeed, the Legatum Institute is about to opine with an index tomorrow on this subject. It'll be interesting to see what they say about less well-off parts of London, the east and the southeast. And it was notable in the Queen's speech yesterday, not only no discussion of devolution, but a very strong sense that the UK government is now rolling back devolution to Scotland and Wales and spending money in those countries directly outside the Barnett formula as part of a rolling back on devolution, not only in England, but also in Scotland and Wales as well. So in the sense, the whole devolution dynamic has shifted. There's not going to be, I understand, a devolution white paper, merely a levelling up one. And whether that has anything, as Andy Burnham would like, about devolution, I'm sure Andrew will have something to say about that. And finally, we are in the fascinating and curious world, which was slightly visible again in the notes to the Queen's speech yesterday, about whether levelling down wouldn't be a bit easier than levelling up in Britain. There was a very interesting line about the difference in the proportion of graduates in London compared with the Northeast. And as there's no massive plan to increase the number of graduates, the only way you could level that up is by redistributing them. Now, as with, anyway, so there's a kind of levelling up versus levelling down issue, fascinating for Conservative politicians, in my view, given that they used to be very worried about accusations of levelling down, but we'll see. So just to conclude my canter through this subject, I suppose the big question that we now face is the past resilience of London after plagues and fires and wars and everything else still there to be had? Is that it? Or are we moving on to some other model of the United Kingdom where cities, not only London, go into decline again, and other parts of the country, particularly smaller towns and rural areas, become more affluent, and there's an entirely different set of economic, or an entirely different distribution of economy across the UK? Well, that will all get discussed, I'm sure, by our four speakers, who are Ben Rogers, now of the LSE and of the University of London, formerly of the founder of the Centre for London, Madeline Sumption from the University of Oxford, major speaker and researcher, one of Britain's leading on the subject of migration in and out of the UK, international migration, very important subject for us all. Mark Kleinman of King's College, a dear ex-colleague here at the LSE, Professor Mark Kleinman, and Andrew Carter from the Centre for Cities, whose statistical analysis of Britain's cities in a highly accessible and enjoyable way is a feature of all our understanding of cities across the United Kingdom. They're all going to sort of slightly different subjects, but I'll start with you, Ben. I think, Ben, you're going to talk about what's growth, what is good growth, and so on. Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Tony. This is my first event as an LSE fellow, so I'm very pleased to be here. There's a very funny guy on Twitter called Scott Shapiro, who's actually a professor of jurisprudence at Yale, but his specialism on Twitter is making pseudo-profound, sort of vacuous predictions. And in that spirit, I foresee that things are not going to be the same for London after the pandemic as they were before. And then particularly the virus will mark at least the sort of inflection point in London's growth trajectory. And that does raise the question of how we should think about growth and the nature of that trajectory. I mean, what sense did London grow? Has London grown over the last 20 or 30 years? How do they want it to grow in the future? And what is good growth, a key word in the Sadiq Khan's first term as mayor, and the sort of almost the keystone of his London plan. What does good growth mean and look like? So, thinking about growth, I mean, there's clearly the sort of population measure, and here, of course, London has grown pretty dramatically, at least by European standards, if not by world standards, as Tony said, since the early 1990s. I think it's really important when thinking about London's population to distinguish two groups. So the first are the residents, and then the others are the visitors and the commuters. And resident growth has been fueled by high birth rates and migration from the rest of the country and overseas. But we've also seen a really big increase in visitors and commuters. And in fact, in truth, I mean, when people sort of say that London is now, reached the size it was in 1939, I'm always want to say, not really. It's much bigger than it was in 1939 because of all the overseas visitors and because of all the commuters. And that's why when you look at films and footage of London in 1939, it doesn't look nearly as busy and crowded as it does today. And there doesn't seem to be a sort of settled view among experts as to what's been going on when it comes to migration from the capital since COVID. I mean, there's been various reports suggesting a big outflow, but these have been challenged. And the surveys that I've seen that actually ask people whether they're planning to leave don't show any noticeable sort of uptick in people saying that they're planning to leave the capital than was the case before the pandemic. But we do know we've seen a big decline in visitors and commuters. I mean, I think that is the sort of really sort of big population impact of the pandemic, both from outside London into London and then from everywhere into central London. And that's really hit the economy hard, and especially the sort of central London economy. So that's sort of, population. Then there's economic growth, and London's record on job creation has been truly impressive over the last 30 years, and particularly over the last 10 years since the recession, and over the long term, a big increase in GVA relative to the rest of the country. So we've really, we have sort of, we've become a much bigger player as a city and as a region in the UK economy. But perhaps we do need to unpack the economic picture a bit, because productivity did grow really fast, through the 90s and the noughties, but has actually more or less plateaued since the recession. So, it used to be the case that there was a sort of national productivity problem or puzzle, but not a London one. But now we've got both. Wealth inequality has grown massively in London, and so a lot of the increase in wealth has gone to a small number of people, largely property owners. And median incomes after housing costs have flatlined over sort of 20 years and converged with the rest of the country. So much for London racing ahead. And of course, poverty has remained steadily high, while the number living in poverty, rather than the proportion, which was already larger than any other region, has gone up fastest. And I always do emphasize this point that when you're talking about London, it's important to talk about proportions, but it's also really important to talk about absolute numbers, just because they're sort of so large in the capital. So sort of, a mixed picture even on those sort of economic indicators. And then there are sort of wider measures of growth, and we all know, I'm sure we all agree that mainstream economic measures like GDP are very, very, limited. I mean, they have their place, but they miss out on all sorts of things that people say that they value, and people say, make for a prosperous life, and with good reason. And there's now a host of frameworks that try to capture things that traditional economic measures miss. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, I guess, are the best known ones, being worked by Amartya Sen and Nussbaum and others on capabilities. In the UK, New Economics Foundation have done a lot of work on this. Diana Coyle, Dimitris Angelis, and others at the Bennett Institute in Cambridge are doing some really interesting work thinking about sort of wealth and how you sort of conceptualize and measure wealth beyond sort of financial wealth and physical capital, human capital, natural capital, social and institutional capital. In London, you've got Henrietta Moore's Prosperity Institute, doing some interesting work on how you should think about and measure prosperity and the importance of involving people in that. So this is sort of, now I think sort of really sort of rich. I mean, I'm not an expert in it, but sort of, literature and body of expertise about sort of richer ways of measuring growth and wealth and prosperity. I'm not sure how much has been done really looking at London's development through that prism recently. I mean, I haven't seen anything. And my sense would be, whatever framework you took, the picture would be a very, very mixed one. It seems clear that London does better than parts of the country on some of these dimensions of growth, probably better on things like sustainability, cohesion, social infrastructure, transport, and less well than others. There was an interesting Demos report with PwC about 10 years ago. It was quite sophisticated, in which they asked people, and they built up a picture of what people think counts for sort of prosperity and well-being, and then looked at how the country performed. And against that measure, London was about the worst performing region, largely because of inequality, because of commuter times, because of lack of disposable income. But Demos have just done a report recently, I saw, by the same author, Kitty Usher, which asked people about their satisfaction with the place where they live. And their London did better than almost any other country, largely because of the local social capital, transport, So I guess it does depend a bit on how you measure these things. I mean, what I think is interesting is that the mayor has, in his manifesto, well, to be fair, all the mayors, I mean, particularly Ken, did put quite a lot of weight beyond GDP and those narrow economic measures on sustainability. Sadiq has talked a lot about, as I said, good growth. And then in his manifesto, there is a pledge to develop a new measure of growth. And I don't know how he proposes to do that, but that would be interesting to see what he makes of that. And I hope we can all contribute. But turning finally to the impact of COVID and sort of future prospects, both on, I suppose, the narrower economic understandings of growth and the sort of broader ones. I mean, as I said, the virus hit the economy, or some parts of it, especially hard. It has been very much a sort of tale of two cities, as it always is in London. So actually, knowledge economy workers, like probably most of us on this call today, found that they could work from home and didn't affect them too badly. But the face-to-face sectors, so hospitality, performing arts, really suffered, and the workforce in those sectors is overwhelmingly young, foreign, and poorly paid. So that is clearly going to sort of exacerbate existing inequalities and sort of problems in London. And while we don't know how long it will take the economy to recover, or to what extent it will recover, I think it's bound to take the worst hit sectors some time to recover. I mean, there's a lot of discourse out there about how the country's going to bounce back very quickly, and we've got all these sort of savings. But if you think about the way in which London does depend on commuters and tourists, I don't think those things are going to bounce back quickly. And beyond that, we just really don't know how sticky the new ways of living and working will prove to be. But growth is not given independent of policy, depends a lot on government decisions. But here in London, we quickly knock up against the fact, as Tony's already suggested, that the mayor and boroughs really don't have very much power over the levers that really matter. And we have a government that makes a virtue out of its anti-London bias. So what could the mayor and other London leaders do? I mean, I've been really sort of wrestling with this. I don't envy Sadiq. I mean, I think probably, I'd rather be mayor of London than leader of the Labour Party, but not by much. And I think it's important to keep making the case for the capital, for its place and contribution to the rest of the country and for devolution. But when it comes to sort of, what I would do, how you would generate growth, and particularly sort of good growth, or the sort of richer models, I mean, I think probably I would go with the spirit of the times and, think about what sort of frugal, green, sort of bottom up innovations can make a difference, especially to low-income Londoners and disadvantaged communities. And I think some of the stuff that's being done. So I mean, I've been looking to ways of supporting local economies, local green infrastructure, social or mutual enterprise, participatory, co-produced public services. I think the sort of stuff that Tessie Britton is doing in Barking Dagenham in participatory city is really, really interesting. I think there's quite a lot of mileage in some of that. I don't think that's going to sort of be a magic bullet. I feel slightly like sort of home cures for cancer, if I'm honest. But on the other hand, I feel, it's almost all we've got at this point in London's trajectory.
Okay, Ben, thank you very much. We'll go straight over to Madeline. I should have added when I was introducing you, Madeline, you are, of course, a member of the Migration Advisory Committee, which advises the government on its migration policy. That makes you even more important to our understanding of this issue. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the nice introduction and for inviting me to speak. And I should say, everything I'll say is in my not in my Migration Advisory Committee capacity, but as my Oxford capacity. So I thought I'd just say a few things about what we expect the role of migration to be in London's recovery over the coming years. Probably it'd be useful just to start by saying a few things about kind of where we are now and what's happened. And Ben touched on some of this already. The pandemic appears to have had a really dramatic impact on migration patterns. And for various technical reasons that I won't go into the weeds of, we don't actually know how many people have emigrated. There's a huge amount of uncertainty about this, various different data sources saying different and inconsistent things. What I think we can say is first that, in terms of migration, what's happened in the past year is a huge break from the past. So London had been experiencing, continuous, relatively high growth in the migrant population and the migrant workforce, and that stalled and probably went into reverse in 2020, with the caveats about the data being a bit problematic. The second thing is it does really seem like London has been particularly affected by the changes in migration patterns. So if you look at the data that was published in March about looking at the number of employees on payroll in the year ending the fourth quarter of 2020. As you will know, that London suffered sort of net losses of employee jobs that were much bigger as a percentage of the workforce than the rest of the UK. And what I think is really striking about this is that over 50% of that net decline in the number of employees was accounted for by migrants, more than 100,000 people. And that's really different from the rest of the country, where it was only 11%, much more kind of consistent with similar percentage declines in the number of employees among migrants and non-migrants. But that wasn't the case in London, where migrants have been hit really hard. The other thing that I think is interesting and distinctive about London is that it's not just EU employees who saw net declines, but also non-EU, which, and I think this is probably related to the big decline that we saw in the number of visas issued for people coming in, particularly work visas. We saw a big decrease in demand in 2020. And we also saw fewer people, there's some evidence that fewer people were taking up visas that they had, and that people who held visas left early. And so we've got to remember, obviously, London is the major user of work visas in the UK. And so that's probably one of the reasons that we kind of, unlike the rest of the UK, London did see this big, it's not enormous, but pretty substantial decline in non-EU employees, like around 28,000 in the year leading up to the fourth quarter of 2020. So what does all this mean? I mean, in the short, there's a debate about the economic impacts of this. In the short run, it's not necessarily problematic from an economic perspective to have lower migration during a period of rising unemployment. Now, you'd expect it to reduce some of the pressure on the labour market and possibly reduce some of the risks that migrants might suffer worse long-term outcomes as a result of having entered into a weak labour market. But of course, the picture will potentially be slightly different in the longer term. And that brings us, I think, to the other big thing that's happened, of course, which is Brexit. So we had the post-Brexit immigration system introduced that came into force, obviously under development for a while, but came into force in the middle of the pandemic. What the system does essentially, it ends free movement and introduces a system which for EU citizens is much more restrictive than what we had before, and where a lot of the system that a lot of EU citizens currently living in the UK would not have qualified for if they had to apply for it. Obviously, the people who are already living here are allowed to stay. So it's much more restrictive for EU, but it is more liberal for non-EU. So there's a wider range of jobs that people can apply for work visas to come and work in. Now, before COVID happened, the expectation was that when this came in, it would be quite a significant shock for many employers who have become quite reliant on free movement, particularly in lower wage jobs. The classic examples there, retail and hospitality, the major employers of EU migrants, and most of those people would not be eligible for visas in the future system. Now, in practice, the impact of that new system will have been delayed by COVID because those industries are not that would have been most affected are currently not really hiring in large numbers. So it's probably it'll be more in the medium term that we start to see how employers are responding to that new system. And there's a kind of second and related point, which is that when we do start to see a stronger economic recovery, the role that migration plays in that may not be the same as it has been in the past. So after the global financial crisis, for example, when the economy recovered, EU migration was quite responsive to that. So we saw a big decline in people coming in as unemployment rose, and then immigration bounced back afterwards from EU countries. The more restrictive system that we have now means that sort of bounce back is not likely to be as significant. However, we do obviously have a slightly more liberal non-EU system, particularly for middle skilled jobs, chefs, for example, now being eligible for work visas in much larger numbers. So that, I think, will create quite a lot of uncertainty. And then the final issue I'll just point to things to be aware of is that Brexit complicates the status of some EU citizens who in London's population. So on the one hand, you've got people already who have status here, for example, under the EU settlement scheme, who were here before the end of last year. And but if there have been significant absences, if they've spent time, say, working from home during the pandemic, that could affect people's ability to qualify for legal status in the long run. And it's not clear how many understand that's the case, that they could lose their status as a result of a long absence. And then the other thing, obviously, in sort of looking at people arriving under the new system, we are, it's very difficult to measure, but one expects to see more pressure for irregular migration as a result of the fact that free movement has come to the end, and that a lot of jobs that migrants have been doing aren't eligible for work visas anymore. So obviously, if that happens, there are all sorts of pressures that brings, in both terms of vulnerabilities for migrants themselves, and also, of course, implications for local authorities that are tasked with supporting more vulnerable people, that being, of course, actually one of the very few areas of immigration policy where it is local government that is playing the major role. So I will leave it there.
Okay, Madeline, thank you very much. Fascinating subject, actually, with all sorts of implications: irregular migration, more migrants from outside the EU with presumably a very different profile, and so on, which could profoundly affect where migrants end up going to live in the UK, I'm guessing, and that's another intriguing future consequence potentially. Right, Mark, I know you've been blogging about this subject, the future. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tony. So I was asked to talk about London as a global city in this context. And the first thing really to say is that London isn't just a global city, it's the global city, along with its twin, New York. It usually comes in that category of its own by various ways of ranking the urban hierarchy. And of course, we've had 30 years kind of slightly congratulating ourselves on this. And what we've seen is that those very characteristics that drive the economic success of global cities have made places like London and New York particularly vulnerable to COVID. First of all, in the immediate sense of the spread of the disease because they're transport hubs, but more generally because of the importance of a whole set of sectors which interconnect, like tourism, including business tourism, hospitality, and so on. So that creates a situation, I think, where both because of COVID and also because of Brexit, as some of the previous speakers have spoken about, I don't expect that, or rather, I do expect that London will come back fairly quickly and will continue to maintain roughly the sort of role it has at the moment. But it's going to have to work a lot harder. And so in terms of all those characteristics which different agencies and academics use to try and rank global cities, I think we're going to see a new series of related categories, which are around public health, safety in a broader sense than just absence of crime and terrorism, and perhaps well-being in a wider sense. And we can already see that some cities are positioning themselves in terms of having coped well with COVID, or relatively well compared with other places. So, for example, when I read material from the Committee for Sydney, without it being, overly boosterish, it's saying, there's an opportunity here because of how Sydney in particular, or New South Wales generally, has coped with the pandemic. And one can think of other examples around the world. There are particular impacts of this, of course, as the other speakers have mentioned, on the central business district, or the central activity zone, as we call it in London. And I think what's important there is to always bear in mind, this is a very complex ecosystem. So, we can look at hospitality, and we can look at culture, and we can look at financial and business services, and we can look at entertainment and so on. But I think the key aspect of London as a global city, and New York and other places, is these sectors all interconnect very closely. So if you're looking at how quickly central London will respond, it's not just a question of what happens with hospitality, it's how many big conferences are there going to be? What happens to the pattern of business meetings? Are there going to be as many as there were before, or are people going to be doing more online meetings like this? So it's very difficult to predict that exactly because of this interaction. But as I say, I would expect London to come back fairly strongly. And of course, the recovery will create possibilities for winners as well as losers. In other words, if you're the city that gets it right, both on economic competitiveness, but also public health, safety, well-being, you are very well positioned for that. So I don't see this really leading to a radical change in the hierarchy, if you like, but it certainly creates the incentives for a more interesting or a different kind of race between cities. Then just moving on a little bit so that's kind of London as a global city in terms of its competitor, and remember its competitor cities are also cooperator cities as well, so it's a complex pattern there. In terms of London's position within the UK urban hierarchy, and again, as some of the other contributors have already mentioned, what about levelling up? Well, from what I see over the last couple of years, but also in the headlines from the Queen's speech, levelling up doesn't actually involve any serious attempt at developing alternative economic centres of power within the UK to London. It seems to refer rather to possible reallocation of resources, distributing money even more thinly than it has been in the past. So whereas under previous governments you saw some concentration, say on the core cities, or with the previous Conservative administration very specifically on Manchester, this is being spread out now across, or the intention seems to be to spread money, and it's not large amounts of money, across a wider number of areas. So I don't see there being any real attempt at creating a countervailing power to London. And that's bad as well as good for London. I mean, it's good in a very narrow sense, in that London's role is going to continue, but it's still, I think, a fundamentally unsustainable model that you have one very powerful economic agency in London and the Greater South East, really, which is relied on to continually bring in investment, create jobs, and of course supply the fiscal wherewithal to support public services everywhere. That's not good for the rest of the UK, and it's not good for London either, but I think it's going to continue. Just a couple of thoughts in relation to that about how the urban system might develop as a whole. What seems to be happening is, in a sense, London is getting bigger and bigger. And Ben talked about the fact that you need to think about visitors and commuters as well as pure population. But I think we need to think a bit more about the whole of that wider Greater Southeast region, because that's really the economic driver. And what we're seeing is a certain amount of relocation of people and economic activity, sort of outside London, but perhaps just to other growth poles within that Greater Southeast region. And as Madeline and others have said, we know there's been some temporary movement out of London. Is some of that going to be permanent? I think some of it might be, but it's more likely to be to Oxford, Brighton, Cambridge than it is to further away parts of Britain. But Andrew might want to pick up on that. Just the final point on that, I think you've seen actually in the elections last week, some possible electoral consequences of this, actually away from the Tories and towards the other two parties. So Oxfordshire and Cambridgeshire have both moved from Conservative to no overall control. The Metro Mayor for Cambridgeshire and Peterborough has moved directly from Conservative to Labour, wasn't expected. losses of seats in places, and also similarly in West of England, which was slightly more anticipated. Losses of seats in Worthing, Tunbridge Wells, St Albans, and so on. So a few cracks, only small cracks in the blue wall, as well as large holes in the red wall, possibly. I've also seen, I think I saw in the Queen's speech, continuing commitment to HS2. And I think one way of thinking about HS2, maybe the best way of thinking about HS2, it enlarges the London region because it brings a number of other cities into faster journey times, and so expands that one area of economic growth. So I think London will continue to grow after, an important hiatus and with qualifications. And I think it will do so partly because it has to for the UK, and that's not altogether a good thing for London either. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I suppose the real difficulty that Britain has is that allowing the wider southeast to grow to 21 million people in the first place makes it quite difficult to get away from that accidental starting point. Anyway, Andrew, over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Tony. I think that is a good point, and not to. So I agree with everything that's been said, and trying not to repeat it and get into a bit more of a discussion. Just reflecting on your opening comments, really, Tony, about how London is viewed and how London is thought about. I offer three observations to the way that the current government, maybe previous governments as well, but the current government thinks about London, which I think then colours what happens as a result of that. Whether they're right or wrong, we can debate that. The first one, I think, is that current government is less convinced by the arguments around agglomeration more generally. I think they are more skeptical about that kind of view of how the economy organizes itself and why it does so. And I think you can see that there are political reasons, but I think there's others, in the sense you can see that in what Mark was saying about how the government talks about towns and cities and, everywhere, and London and not London. So I think there's a kind of, that's an underlying question. And obviously the experiences that we've had over the last 12 months can, if you allow it to, can play into that sort of area that, many of our cities, they've lost their raison d'etre, et cetera, the way that we work is going to fundamentally change, et cetera. So it gives you a way to go further on that sort of perspective if you desire. My second kind of observation would be, again, the current government, again, previous governments, but it's not only the government. I think there's a wider sense in the country that London has been over-preferenced by government decisions and investment. Now we can debate, the merits of those arguments, and we've often done it. And there's some shoddy analysis that is often done to make the political point. But there's a kind of wider view that London has got more out of government. London's got more out of government than maybe other places, and it's now the time of other places. So even if one can agree that London still has needs and investment opportunities, or investment needs, however we define them, there's a sense that, well, you've had your more than your fair share, and you just have to, get to the back of the queue. And again, in Mark's context, if you think about, that's about redistributing a set pot of money, which we seem to be in some respects, then if one place gets more, the other places by definition have to get less. So I think there's a sort of that element to it as well. And then my third element, maybe this is more political of it, but I think it's important, and is the current government is less convinced. We may say, well, we would say this, wouldn't they? Is less convinced that the current mayor is doing everything he can to help London grow and recover from COVID. Again, we can debate the merits of that, right? But that's part of the story. And you can see that most obviously in the debates and the interchange between government and the mayor on the London plan and the housing numbers. And I think you could see that, and you can continue to see that in relation to TfL and what it requires in a kind of ongoing subsidised basis because of the collapse in passenger fares as well. But I think there's a broader sense, and by the way, it doesn't only apply to London. I think you mentioned this in your introduction, Tony. It applies to Wales and it applies to Scotland as well, and it applies to the other metro mayors. I think, like, hang on a minute, we have these institutions, they're doing things that we don't like them doing. That can't be the right way to proceed, can it? Is kind of, you know, where you get to on those kind of things. So we can say lots of other things, we get into the detail of it, but I think those three elements just give a bit of context for how decisions may or may not be made, and where London sits in some of those things, in terms of, you know, the next few years, particularly through this particular Parliament. So I'll hand that back to you after that.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Thank you all. I mean, just picking up from something you said there, Andrew, and others have touched on, that the we don't really know what the impact of COVID and Brexit are, do we? The impact of one is masking the other, and their full impact on the UK economy will only be known 2 years after the ONS has published the relevant data. I'm not being critical of ONS, so I think have done a sterling job during the pandemic to give us a whole load of new data. But one thing they can't find, and Madeline referred to this, is data about population, data about migration, data about business at a regional level. There's not much of any of these. And I say I'm not being critical of them because I think they've done amazingly well. But I suppose, Andrew, straight back to you just to begin. I mean, is there a slight risk that the government is going to be setting up about levelling up the country without actually knowing what the economy of different parts of the country and different people in different parts of the country really are?
Oh yes, I mean, I think we shouldn't worry too much about whether the ambition of levelling up is kind of fact-based or evidence-based. I'm being slightly too black and white on that. I think, you know, there is an ambition that this government has. Previous governments have expressed it slightly differently. The actual state of the economy, the state of the place that they are talking about, as you say, you know, we never have full sight on those kind of issues for certain. I think, you know, there is a mismatch there between what is actually going on in these places, and indeed, you know, what types of investments then ultimately need to be made. In part, you could offer a critique of why our investment in many places hasn't succeeded is precisely because of that point. In a sense, it's trying to do something that actually we don't really know whether that something is required. My other observation I would make, which I think again has been touched on by others, which I think is important, is, you know, the degree to which, and I'm with Mark and probably Ben and yourself, is that I do think London recovers. But if you believe that, which I do, and you're in government, then essentially you can say we can leave it alone. We don't really need to do more than, you know, the necessary. We can leave it and it will recover over time because, you know, because of the factors that we've all discussed. Now that may well be a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it may not. And I think there is, by the way, I think there's a kernel of truth in that. I think we can also say there were many places in the country that were struggling long before Brexit, long before the pandemic, and those Brexit and pandemic makes it worse, doesn't make it easier, so that, you know, there is a rationale for investment. But again, if you're looking for a political narrative, the fact you don't really know what's going on, you have to wait, plus if you believe that it bounces back, gives you the ammunition you need in order to make the arguments that you would ultimately want to make.
Okay, great. And Mark, you mentioned the what others have called this sort of more performative nature of the government's allocation of money to show it's doing something about levelling up. Obviously, we've got the Towns Fund and the Levelling Up Fund and the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. In fact, there's loads of others with fund type names. And intriguingly, I mean, some of them, I'm not sure, it's some that London can't bid for, and others only Scotland. I mean, Scotland will be able to get money out of some of these funds, which is a curious place to have ended up. But I suppose I'm going back more closer to something that you implied, which is, could these kind of funds, these small pots of cash, even with the FE improvements that are suggested by the Queen's speech yesterday, really in 3 to 5 years make a radical change to the structure of the UK economy, which has been moving to the direction it has been for 50, some would say 100 years? I mean, sorry, that question's a bit loaded, isn't it? But you know what I mean.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's true. We've had all sorts of regional policy over the past 50, 60 years and more, and it hasn't really had a huge amount of impact. But I think what is significant about the current government's policy approach, and perhaps I'm retrofitting a rationale, which isn't actually how they'd express it, but you could simply say, look, there are a number of places which have really suffered, and we think it's important to direct investment there. So high streets look a bit better. So there's some new housing there. So there's a more even spread slightly of cultural facilities, whatever. And, we can debate whether that's a good or a bad thing, but that's perfectly consistent. But that is not the same as saying we want to create, through investment, infrastructure, skills enhancement over a long period of time, countervailing economic powers within the UK. So, in the new Labour governments, and I was a civil servant, at one point there, I'm pretty sure we had a public service agreement target. I'm now struggling to remember it, but it was something like reducing the gap growth rates across regions. I mean, that's a very tall order, but it's also a very clear statement of government policy. And, with George Osborne, there was a very concerted attempt to boost up Greater Manchester, whether, that was the right thing to do or how effective it was. But there was a clear idea. We need somewhere that's not London, and moving various facilities and investments from London to Manchester was part of it. I don't really see any story like that now. And as I say, you can make up a rationale for that policy, but it certainly means that London will continue to dominate the UK economy going forward. I can't see that changing.
And I mean, just building on that, it's given that the government's idea of sort of sending civil servants out and sending bits of Channel 4 and regulators out, they are sent out in a very spread out way. So some go to Wolverhampton, some go to Stockport, some go to Glasgow. And that's the antithesis of creating a pole other than the big one. I mean, but you made that point. I think it is, and I sometimes wonder whether they fully thought that through myself. Madeline,
just on that.
Yeah,
I mean,
go, Andrew. Go on. Come on.
On Mark's point, I mean, absolutely right in terms of the. I mean, just give or take, you just but magnitude sort of things. Kind of London is what, somewhere's between 20 and 25% of the UK economy, depending on how you measure it. It's roughly that. Our next biggest places like West Midlands or Greater Birmingham, if you want to call it that, or Greater Manchester are about 3 to 4%. So there's that, and those two are the next biggest places. So as you say, the magnitude of of the influence and the differential between the first and the second is very kind of primate city type arrangements for those of us that remember our learnings from all those days back in school.
Yes, and as the Institute for Government, the excellent Institute for Government has pointed out, there's been a big growth in the number of civil servants in London because of Brexit. And so I'm not sure the total number of those will be as many as have moved out, but that's for somebody else to research. Now, Madeline, clearly you've made this point that migration is going to change the UK. There's maybe less of it, certainly less low-paid migration, low-skilled migration, not quite the same thing. But as it's going, as you said yourself, there'll be fewer people coming from Europe and more from, well, if we remember history, the new Commonwealth and Africa and East Asia. Do we think more of that, the new migrants, the relative of the total who come, more are likely to stay in cities, perhaps, because that was the pattern with new Commonwealth immigrants in the past, and less likely to spread out across the UK? Do we have any idea about whether that's the case?
Yes, I mean, I think obviously if we just look at the nationality, where people from different parts of the world have settled in the past, and then assume that that's going to be broadly similar in the future, you would expect, assuming that we get less Eastern European migration, for example, a lot of those people, particularly from the first cohort of countries that joined the EU in 2004, particularly Poland. A lot of people from Poland and other Eastern European countries. One of the things that was distinctive about that kind of migration is that they settled in areas, for example, in the East Midlands or East of England, that hadn't traditionally been major destinations for migration, and that was that's definitely that was very much different from the kind of traditional. London was the major destination for non-EU migrants before that, and still is. I think it's probably that has shifted a little bit though, because actually after 2007 and particularly after 2014, we started to see more people from Romania and Bulgaria, and they again were actually more focused on London.
Yeah.
They didn't distribute so widely. So I think it's interesting how the system will affect where people live. I mean, quantitatively the biggest impacts of a more restrictive immigration policy are likely to be on London, just because the share of all migrants going to London is actually really high, even though there's some variation. And that's the case even despite the fact that a lot of people are coming on work visas are going to have to qualify based on salary, among other things. So that gives people in London an advantage, but not enough of an advantage, I think, to mean that sort of the total quantitative impact that you would expect is going to be greater than in London. The only other thing I'll mention is that we do see some kind of occupational variation as well. Again, if you look at work visas, there's been a lot of growth in the number of people coming as in the health and social work sector over the last 5 years or so, and that is more evenly distributed than other kinds of migration. So whereas London sees much larger numbers of people coming in IT and then the kind of finance and insurance industries. Those are the ones, the latter, health actually, has continued to be a lot of demand, obviously, for health workers, but there was a massive decline in IT workers coming to the UK. So some of those dynamics will play out, but I think probably in reasonably unpredictable ways. I would still very much expect London to be the major destination for international migrants under the new system.
And any early signs of where Hong Kong migrants are going to decide to live in the UK? Do we have any data about that yet?
We don't, not yet, and we might not have some for a little while, just because when they apply for the visa, they don't have to specify where they're going to live, so we don't necessarily have admin data, and that there may need to be a decent number of people here from Hong Kong before we can start to get reliable data on where they're living.
That'll be fascinating to wait for. Okay, thanks for that. And finally to Ben, then I'm going to open, I've got some quick Q&A coming in. I mean, I think we're all taking, and you didn't quite, so that's not a criticism. The idea that we sort of just get back to growth is an easy thing for us all to do, be it levelling up to the Midlands and the North, or helping the Scots grow more, or ensuring London's allowed to continue to grow. But there are moves out in some parts of politics to have a sort of different approach to growth, which is a bit less pro-growth, really. And that are we all mesmerised by the long period of London growing 3, 4, 5, whatever it was, 2, 3, 4% a year, we sort of mesmerised then not to look at the possibility that less growth but a more managed kind of growth might be better? You're silent. Well, you're not silent, but you're not heard.
No, I think that's exactly right, and I think that's just the point I was trying to make. I think there is some Centre for London are doing this big London Futures review, and they've got these sort of 5 scenarios for the sort of future of London, and one of which is sort of mega London, which is basically London continuing in a way that it has done, bigger population, more investment in radial infrastructure, potentially absorbing 1 or 2 districts around the neighborhood. You take that out to Londoners, which they've been doing, business communities to sort of school kids. None of them vote for that one. None of them are interested in that one. They all want the sort of green one or the more equal one. Now you could say that's just like a YIMBY-ist, of course you're here in London. Why would you want more people to come in? But the resonance of the 15-minute city, the sort of very strong showing for the Greens. I mean, there's definitely, I think people have sort of to some degree sort of seen new possibilities in the pandemic, and Andrew was sort of slightly referring to that in a different way, in the way in which sort of the government actually sees new possibilities for a sort of more distributed country. I'm not sure how realistic that is. And so I mean I don't see it. I'm probably a bit less confident about London bouncing back, at least in the short term. I mean, I do think that it's going to. I'd be surprised. I think some of these behaviours around, only going to the office or not working from home, not travelling as much, or just some of the sort of just the barriers around, whether around migration or just sort of passport regimes at airports and things, are going to make a difference. Now, maybe that London can capitalise on that in other ways because it's also a sort of centre of sort of digital business, and actually there's lots of ways that could play to London's advantage. I mean, if you're going to study remotely, you might well want a degree from the University of London more than you want a degree from the University of Swansea. I mean, no disrespect to Swansea, but there's lots of ways in which the rise of sort of digital, a more digital economy will play to the advantage of global capitals. Paradoxically, I think or indeed, if you decide you're going to travel less and you're only going to come to Europe once in your life, then you're going to go to London. So I mean, it may be the case. There's certain ways which play out London, but I'm scared. I'm certainly thinking in the short term it's going to be a very, very bumpy ride.
Yeah, and it took quite a long time after 1945, in fairness to the point you just made. Let's go to some of the Q&A here. Tony Zellinger, who's helpfully asked a number of questions, so you definitely deserve to have one answered, which relates to what you were just saying, and actually underpins much of what we've been discussing in terms of the economy, which is with knowledge workers returning to their offices, will they continue to tolerate overcrowded public transport? I think it's will, actually. So will knowledge workers returning to their offices continue to tolerate overcrowded public transport? And will their dissatisfaction encourage further expenditure for improving our infrastructure? Or if I can build on a point, I'm sorry, Tony, to add, I mean, might it actually lead to a kind of sprawl? So if people are not prepared to travel every day or other than in the off-peak time, doesn't that kind of, I think Mark referred to this, create the sort of pressure for what I've called elsewhere the sort of Los Angelesification of the southeast into a great sprawl where public transport doesn't work anymore? The same might be said about Manchester, by the way, or anywhere else that relies on people coming in and out of an agglomerated city centre. What do you think about that, Mark?
I'm trying to unmute. Right.
You have.
Yes. I don't think you should necessarily link it to LA type sprawl. So
Okay.
First let's go back one. I don't think anybody really knows how the office of next year and the year after is quite going to work. So I think we seem to be converging on a hybrid solution, but exactly what that means, nobody can say. And I think for good reason. I think there'll be an awful lot of trying things out and changing things around, and different sorts of workers will want different kinds of working patterns. I'm talking here about white collar workers of different kinds who can work from home at least some of the time. So that will take some time to play through. But one consequence can be that the London labour market actually expands, because if you're commuting twice or three times a week rather than 5, you can live further away. And I know there's a certain amount of chat you see on the internet about, well, if someone can live in Brighton and do the job in London, so can someone on the other side of the world who will be cheaper. And that's true. But I think a hybrid pattern implies not 100% remote working, but the ability to come in for meetings and for special events and so on. So you could see an expansion of the commuter field. Whether that leads to more overcrowding or less, I will leave to one of our transport specialists who, need to be modelling this. But you can see that TfL in various reports they've produced are beginning to think about that and what the consequences of that might be. So the old model of commuters who buy commuter tickets and then people who use it for leisure with an off-peak ticket in the middle of the day, it's going to have to be a lot more flexible than that.
Yes, Andrew, commuters have definitely got one over the peak fare system that has so soaked money out of them for many years. Andrew.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think Mark is absolutely spot on. And I think in some respects, what applies to the worker also applies to firms and businesses. In a sense, the businesses that are located somewhere else in the country that can't afford to be in London 3 days a week and have permanent real estate and all the rest of it may well make a decision that actually now, if prices come down, which they may do because of changes, but also because they only need to be in the centre of London or in London somewhere for 2 or 3 days a week, it suddenly becomes affordable. So you relocate your firm that is placed in X, you close it there, and actually you take temporary or episodic kind of space in London, which is not really what people kind of are talking about when they talk about leveling up and remote working and all the rest of it. As well, you can perfectly envisage and imagine that kind of scenario, and you see firms that are looking to expand. I saw only this week, Greggs are opening up in Canary Wharf. Why are they doing that now? Because they can afford to do so, and they couldn't afford to do so before. They're also kept out because Canary Wharf didn't want firms like Greggs as part of their estate. But nevertheless, right? I mean, this works for what works for workers works for firms. So that these things kind of work out in different ways that we are, as Mark said, we're not sure yet which way it goes.
Ben.
I mean, cities are all about, efficiency and coming up with sort of efficient, sustainable solutions. And actually this potentially is like this whole thing could be is a huge boost to both sustainability and efficiency if it plays out right. I mean, there was something sort of slightly mad about the way everybody got on the train or into the car 5 days a week, left their homes empty. I mean, we don't need to meet like that. I mean, so sometimes I feel this is going to be a very benign. This is challenge to be a very benign disaster.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point. I see exactly what you mean, but I do sometimes wonder whether the Chinese may have backed the wrong model if that's the case, and other countries that have got these massive new cities all over the place with lots of commuting and undergrounds, but that's for another event. Now, James Stevens says, Mark argues that the government hasn't a realistic strategy to create an alternative pole for the economic growth outside of London. There is, however, the Oxcam growth arc, which does have significant potential. Or does that reinforce the tendency towards a megacity? Now, I've often wondered about this myself. I mean, Andrew, Oxford and Cambridge and doubtless Milton Keynes are all part of your happy brood at the Centre for Cities, as well as London. So I've always thought it probably did reinforce a megacity. But I mean, what would you think if you were the leader of Bradford or the leader of Newcastle upon Tyne about the Oxford-Cambridge growth arc? No,
exactly. I think you're absolutely right. In a sense, they are three incredibly well-performing places and have been, for a good number of years. They now experience quite a few challenges as a result of that growth. Particularly, Oxford is the most unaffordable place in the country in terms of buying a home. In terms of our sort of urban areas, more expensive than London. Cambridge isn't far off it. So I suppose the question there becomes one. So we can take for granted to a degree that if we permitted more development in that area, that it would happen because demand is incredibly strong and it would be taken up. The question, I think, interestingly becomes whether those places themselves are prepared to permit more development, particularly on the scale that the ARC is suggesting, and whether the government can get away with diverting some of its resources to facilitate more development through housing and or transport when it's telling us that it's all about levelling up. And again, I think that's an interesting dynamic that the government is going to find itself in, really, as to whether the people of wherever, somewhere else in the country, are going to say, hang on a minute, why are you putting money into transport in the Oxford-Cambridge corridor when you told us it was all about leveling up? You know, the merits of the debate and the argument get skewed out because of the, you know, because of the intentions of what the government wants to do. But if we, you know, if you put stuff in there, you can be fairly confident that more development will happen. And those three places are definitely part of the mega region of London. That's, you know, that explains a significant part of their expansion over the last 20, 25 years.
I'm going to come to you, Madeline, with a separate question on a different subject in a minute. But Mark, do you want to say, give this was sort of you started this, as they say. Would you like to say anything about it?
I'd agree with what Andrew has just said. The only thing I'd add, I'm not convinced about an ARC or an Oxford-Cambridge corridor, and it could be I haven't seen enough studies of this, but it's much more about the relationship with London. So I think the ARC terminology is probably a bit redundant, but the fact that there is serious investment money going into that ARC is interesting in the context of, are we going to see that kind of longer term approach applied anywhere in the North or Midlands?
Okay, I'll direct two questions at Madeline now. One is from Ian Gordon, our colleague Ian Gordon. One comment on Madeline's significant point about the fact that A8 migrants went further afield than most others. My sense had been this was probably a reflection of employment agencies actively channeling these flows more than in any other case. And another from Richard Durecki, if I can just New York doesn't anticipate foreign tourist numbers returning to pre-COVID numbers till 2025, assuming the same for London. Sadiq's domestic tourist drive will help cut it. Can it save the West End? Sorry, that wasn't for you. I mean, it's the second bit. Does Madeline have any sense of how foreign student numbers may change over the next few years? So foreign student numbers and A8 migrants being channeled to the rest of the country. Is there any evidence on either of these subjects you can give us?
Yes, there is. So on the recruitment agencies, it does, I mean, there's some qualitative evidence that does suggest that they were really important, particularly in the initial periods post-enlargement, in helping people, you know, that people didn't necessarily have a great sense of where they should go in the UK, and they were channeled to particular areas, particularly people who were doing things like seasonal work or working in food processing. That was another area where there was a very strong use of recruitment agencies. I think agencies have been important over time. There was obviously, after a while, once you have settled communities, then there are other dynamics driving migration. You know, the kind of information networks that help people, you know, learn about jobs or housing or what have you. So that there is a little bit of evidence that became more important over time. And then actually, I mean, obviously, even if it was recruitment agencies, the business model of those recruitment agencies sort of crumbles under the new immigration system, in the sense that, with the exception of seasonal agricultural workers, where they, you know, the government has contracted with a handful of recruitment agencies to place people on specific farms. There are no visas available for many of the kinds of jobs that relied heavily on recruitment agencies. That doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be any migration into some of those places, particularly, you know, some of the places around east of England and East Midlands, where recruitment agencies were quite important. Partly because often, once you have established communities, you will then continue to have family migration, for example, to those places, regardless of the sort of job situation and agencies and so forth. On the question about international students,
yep.
It's difficult to say. I mean, we don't yet have the full picture on this in terms of what the impacts of COVID have been in the long term. My assumption, I mean, obviously there are all of these debates about online learning and so forth. My assumption would be that the key factors that have made the UK very attractive for non-EU students would remain in place, although with the caveat, you know, I'm not an expert in higher education by any means. Brexit obviously is an issue, and that creates some uncertainty on the EU side because of because EU students can no longer, you know, come and go as easily as they like, and the conditions for them are different. So there, I think there is there's a fair amount of uncertainty about how that will settle down over time, and whether EU students will then start to find other EU destinations, including Ireland, for example, more attractive than the UK. That, I think, is just something we'll need to keep an eye on.
And then there's the value of sterling, of course, appreciating, which I doubt is very good for recruiting students.
Yeah.
Christine Whitehead has a question, which is really aimed directly, I think, at you, Andrew, but others may want to chip in. I'll come on to you, Ben, as well. What's the evidence about whether growth in London has a more positive effect on growth in other regions than growth elsewhere? So it's kind of getting at a sort of trickle, it's not quite a trickling down, but I mean, is there evidence about whether growth in London has a more positive effect on growth in other regions than if the growth were same growth were elsewhere, if you see what I mean? It's about the interconnectedness of the UK economy.
Yeah, I think there's not definitive evidence that, you're better off, piling. I mean, this is Mark's point, and I would agree with it. It's not this case of piling everything into London, allowing that to grow like, Topsy, and then essentially stuff just leaks out into other parts of the country. I think that's, that isn't the way that we should think about the economy. Quite clearly, through various mechanisms, you see, largely the Southeast is a story about its connectedness to London. We've already talked about Milton Keynes and Cambridge and Oxford, Brighton will be a story partly about the expansion of London down into the Southeast. So that, this mega region, that Sir Peter Hall, used to talk about many, many, many years ago is there in reality, and it spreads, probably over half the country. I think, there is something on that. I think the other thing I would say is that you do see, because of the role that London plays internationally and globally, again, as Mark was saying, in terms of its hub function, you see a distribution of functions within certain industries across space that I think, that London has a role in that. It might operate at the hierarchy of certain industries, but actually activity is then dispersed across different countries, different cities or different places as a result of that. But I think it's right to say we shouldn't be relying on London directly and indirectly to be the major growth pole for the country. Our real challenge for levelling up is actually to make more growth poles, and that, we would argue from the evidence that we've seen and the work that we've done is actually big questions about how Greater Manchester, Greater Birmingham, Greater Leeds, etc., become more prosperous and more dynamic than they currently are, which they're not. Internationally, they're not overly dynamic and prosperous places relative to their sort of cousins in other places.
Okay, I want to move on to the arts. I did half do this by reading out a two-part question from Richard directly. So I'll read it again, then add one Steve Glaister's put in the chat in the questions. So New York doesn't anticipate foreign tourist numbers returning to pre-COVID levels till 2025. Assuming the same for London, Sadiq's domestic tourist drive will help, but can it save the West End? And Steve Glaister has added the enormous importance of the arts and cultural industries to the pre-COVID London economy. And they crucially depend on domestic and international tourism. So I suppose if I can sort of broaden that out a bit, say that 60% of all UK theatre box office is in the West End. That may be over concentration, but it's a special thing. So if that isn't replicated, and the same is true for music and opera and a whole range of performing arts, does that just damage the UK soft power and its broader industries in these fields? And there's a long article in The Guardian about this today. It's not very optimistic. I don't know. Ben, Mark, would you like to have a go at this one? Ben, you're muted again.
I mean, the answer I think is yes. That's a really short answer.
Yes, it's bad, or
I mean, yes, it's going to really hurt those performing arts. And I mean, I just repeat my point. I mean, the London economy has been so reliant and so powered by international visitors. I mean, not just tourists, but the visitor economy as well, which is sort of vast. And I think all the sort of consumer spending, all the sort of savings of sort of affluent people across the rest of the country, they're not going to compensate for that loss of international tourists. I mean, luckily we are sort of, we do understand the case for sort of subsidizing the arts in this country. I don't know how long the Treasury will be willing to go into it. Just another point, completely unrelated, but I just sort of think it's worth saying, which is about the sort of politics of this, which is, I mean, there might be a point where the Conservatives just find that the sort of shires get sort of really sort of restless or restive about, you know, this endless talk about levelling up. You know, when we talked before, Tony, about, you know, the way in which the Conservatives sort of seem to have sort of abandoned London, but that might also come home to roost. I mean, I just wonder whether they will be talking as much about levelling up in a couple of years' time as they are now.
Okay, Mark, what about anything on arts and culture?
Yeah, just to add, I think it's a real issue, as both the questioners and Ben's answer has referred to. But I would draw a distinction between, say, the retail sector, which is really suffering. But, you know, retail was undergoing huge changes. We're not going to go back to 1950s style high streets. There's going to be a new offer. And I think with a lot of arts and culture, one can see that even if it takes till 2025, for New York and London, that cultural scene and art scene will be very important, not just for itself, but as part of the overall offer. So it's a different kind of issue, which I think you're alluding to. How do you actually keep that sector alive and healthy through what could be more than one cycle of reduced audiences and reduced incomes? But it's a different kind of issue to what do we do with those empty spaces on the high street, which are no longer needed for in-person retail.
Okay, and a question from Michael Edwards here. You, I think that's me, are politely saying that government doesn't understand levelling up except geographically, and so much inequality is ubiquitous. Is there any hope of government addressing income or wealth distribution across England or Britain? I think that question kind of contains a slight sense of its own answer, but thank you, Michael. Anybody like to have a go at that one? Because you talked about this, Ben. I mean, this is, and it's related to another question actually that's come in. If I can scroll down to, yeah, Charles Wright. The mayor has made jobs, jobs, jobs his second term mantra, but is there actually very much he can do? What should he be focusing on to boost the economy? And the reason I link those two together is, you know, we've had a mayoral election. There's some discussion of the economy during a mayoral election, but the truth is the UK government controls almost all taxation policy. It controls the future of local taxation. It controls, well, lots of things, and now wants to control more actually in Scotland and Wales. So if I can just, so pushing these together, unless the government believes it wants a radical change to equality or the inequalities in wealth or income, is there much the mayor can do, or indeed any mayor in any city region? Stunned sight. Somebody must want to say something about this. Right, Andrew, you're going to say something, I'm afraid.
Well, let me so on the wealth front, I mean, Michael will know this much better than I, but the work that we've done, you know, if you think about the vast amount of wealth that has been generated in the Greater Southeast is locked up in the housing issues, right? Equity in housing has got, you know, has exploded and significantly grown in the Greater Southeast. London hasn't really grown at all, even if you own a house, which all the benefits, but nevertheless, equity growth in somewhere like Sunderland, you know, it's negligible. So if you were serious about wealth inequalities, you know, questions around the housing system and housing as a method for wealth accumulation would be something. So we'll, you know, can debate the merits of the planning reform, and it'll be interesting to see what happens, you know, through the government's attempts to try and, you know, do something about that. We can, you know, we can debate that. So I think there's something interesting on that. The other thing I would say about this kind of inequality issue, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but, and it's not the first time it's been said, but he said it again. The Prime Minister has said on several occasions, talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not. And I think there's a sense that you know, in London, for whether, again, this is right or wrong, and this is me putting words in the government's mouth. So I think they feel that there's plenty of opportunity, and therefore, you know, we might need to connect people to opportunity, but opportunity exists. Again, we can debate the merits of that position. Whereas if you go to Mansfield, or you go to Grimsby, or you go to Easington, there is talent, you know, in the sense there's, you know, ability wherever we go, but the opportunity is not. And I think that's, you know, so I think that's partly why they're interested in a place-based perspective on the levelling up agenda, even though Michael is right that inequality and poverty exists everywhere, and London has plenty of it. I'm not suggesting it doesn't, but it's the absence of or existence of opportunity, I think, is where the government is trying to get itself to, which is why it then thinks about places and how it might do something about that.
Mark.
Just to follow on from that, yes, I think it's difficult for the Mayor of London or the Mayor of any large city to make huge inroads into this issue, because the main levers are at national level. But there are still things that mayors can do, whether it's in terms of skills, whether it's in terms of working with employers and others to provide opportunities. But at the national level, I think it's interesting to look at what the Biden administration is trying to do, because they're not just chucking very large amounts of money at infrastructure. They're also throwing a lot of money at issues like childcare. And they are also looking at the nature of the labour market negotiation by trying to strengthen the hand of workers. So not all poverty is in-work poverty, of course, but there needs to be some shift in that relative balance between labour and capital if you're serious about tackling these kind of inequalities, which, as other speakers have said, they occur everywhere, and they're much more an intra-place issue than a difference between places.
Now, before we coming to 6:30, I want to come back to Madeline and a migration issue, if I may, which is that none of us knows, you know more than the rest of us, but none of us knows how this is all going to play out. But I'm struck by the fact that some parts of the United Kingdom, if migration slowed down very substantially, would see their population falling. I think I'm right in saying that. Scotland in particular, I realise this is an event about London, not Scotland, but I'm trying to work out the ramifications of the politics of the United Kingdom. So the Scots actually want, that their government says it wants, a more liberal migration policy, but they can't get one because they're part of the UK. So am I right in saying some parts of the UK, probably not London, are going to see a declining working age population and a shrinking population unless UK migration policy reflects different needs in different parts of the UK? And I just wonder whether that might create some resentment against London if it continued to be able to absorb immigrants, where other parts of the UK, given that immigration's fallen completely as an issue of public concern since 2016. So is there any concern, do you think, that, any policy implication of the fact that some parts of the UK will begin to see their population fall, other things being equal, if migration fell away substantially? And would that potentially produce a bit of another rollback against London?
Yes, so this is a big topic to introduce at 6:26.
I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. No, I'm so sorry.
But so to give a kind of short answer, I mean, so there are, Scotland, I think, is the key example of a place that has been reliant. You know, most areas of the UK do have natural growth without migration. Scotland has been quite reliant, particularly on EU migration, because its migrant population has come from EU more. It's more sort of exposed, proportionally at least, to those changes. It's quite difficult. I mean, the trends actually have changed a little bit over time, and so it's quite difficult to make any projections about what will happen in the absence of migration. It's also not just a kind of regional thing, in that there are specific local areas that, within Scotland, for example, that are going to see that might see population decline. Those are not necessarily the areas that that migrants choose to go to, the Highlands. The big policy issue is whether there should be an active policy of trying to encourage people to go to certain areas of the UK, either because those areas want more migration or because, some expert, hopefully not me, has determined that that migration is needed there more. This government has not Boris Johnson, actually, when he was mayor of London, said warm things about the idea of a London visa, but the Conservative government, kind of from Westminster, has generally been pretty negative about the idea of having anything but kind of relatively limited variation in immigration policies by region. I won't get into the politics of exactly why that is, but I think it is something. It's probably not going to happen, regardless of at least under the current government. Regardless of whether it would be a good idea or not.
No, I mean it is ironic that the leaving the European Union has allowed the salience of migration to fall away, and I think it's almost inevitable that other parts of the UK would feel badly treated if London and the southeast gained more migrants and they no longer had access to them. I mean, partly because of all the potential entrepreneurial and startup benefits that come with some migrants. But anyway, it's probably putting too much of myself into this event. Now it's 6:29. So Ben, Madeline, Mark, Andrew, any of you want to say anything before I ask Christine to say a few words not to finish off the whole event, but to say a few words about the series? Anything you haven't said you'd like to say? Ben?
I was sort of amused by Madeline sounding a bit surprised that Boris Johnson would have said something that he was mayor, which he doesn't seem to believe anymore. I have sometimes thought I'm just too lazy to do this, but I really wanted just to start off a sort of Boris Johnson Twitter account where every day I would just quote something that Boris Johnson said as mayor, which he no longer believes. And I think you could probably do it for at least 365 days pretty easily. I'm not sure I could get to the full sort of 4 years, but
very good. Okay, Christine, can I bring you in before I say a couple of concluding words and some thank yous? Christine, you're muted still if you're trying to say something.
I'm unmuted now, I hope. Just to say that the final one of this series, as organised at the moment, is next week at the same time. And it's about London and central government. And I think what I was trying to get at in my earlier question is that many people believe that central government is trying to level London down, rather than simply taking a neutral view of where growth should be. So this will carry through and will be slightly more political, I think, than some of the other ones that we've had. The other question, though, is whether, given that we're into later part of May and Mr. Johnson has apparently said you've all got to go back to work in June, perhaps we might have a hybrid event slightly later on. So I think we're probably only on the next week is only the penultimate one. We'll have a hybrid event of some sort.
Well, that's great news. That means, can that be a hybrid event with non-hybrid wine? Can we get back to that kind of?
For them who are, whichever bit of the hybrid you are, you could have some wine. Well,
I'm seriously worried about public health, but I don't want to provide an incentive here. Sorry, I must make jokes about these things. Right, thank you, Christine. So with luck, we'll be able to get back to some real events soon, which will be hybrid events soon. Look, we've covered a huge array of topics today, which I found massively interesting. So I'd like to thank Ben, Madeline, Mark and Andrew. I think there are a number of topics here which have implications not just for London but for other major cities. I think if we were having this discussion in Manchester or Leeds or Edinburgh or Cardiff, we'd be having a very similar kind of discussion because they are essentially big city issues and about the future of the model that, you know, people like Jim O'Neill, you know, which Manchester really took to, which was based, I'm not sure they put it quite like that, on the idea of London-style agglomeration. Well, there's a big challenge to that as more efforts are made to, you know, I think Ben Houchen is the most interesting example of this. He's made a very good case for a popular form of conservatism to spread economic activity into smaller towns and medium-sized cities and some rural areas across the Tees Valley, which is a long way actually from either London or Manchester or Leeds's former worldview, or indeed Jim O'Neill. So we've come a long way. So great set of subjects we've been able to discuss about cities. I think it would also have worked, by the way, if we've been talking about New York, as Mark says, other cities are having to consider exactly these same issues. So I look forward to seeing you at the next event, which is a week today. Christine, is that right?
That is correct. Week today at the same time, 5 o'clock.
Same time. Well, I'll try and arrive a minute earlier next week. And for those trying to arrange it. So thank you all again. Look forward to seeing you. And as in the best tradition of these things, when somebody clicks leave, it'll just go, the whole thing will end as if we haven't paid the electricity bill, as I always say. Thank you all very much. See you again soon.